The tension in Willow Ridge Estates had reached a fever pitch, and everyone knew it. The HOA called for a second meeting to address the growing unrest, but this time, the turnout was unlike anything I'd ever seen. People arrived early, filling every seat in the community center and spilling into the hallway. Some brought lawn chairs, while others stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with determination. Reporters from local news outlets lingered near the entrance, microphones and cameras ready to capture the drama. It felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom showdown. Karen sat at the front of the room, her usual poise wavering under the weight of so many glaring eyes. She clutched her clipboard tightly, her knuckles white. For the first time, she didn't look confident. She looked nervous. And she should have been. The stakes were higher than ever, and everyone knew it. When the meeting began, the chairperson struggled to maintain order. Voices rose from all corners of the room, demanding answers, expressing outrage, or pleading for compromise. Finally, Karen stood up, attempting to command attention. "Let me explain," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I only want what's best for this community. These upgrades will benefit everyone." But her words fell flat. A man in the back shouted, "No one asked for your upgrades." His voice was met with cheers and applause. Others chimed in, recounting how much they loved the trail exactly as it was. One woman tearfully described how the trail helped her cope with grief after losing her husband. Another neighbor talked about teaching his grandchildren to identify birds and plants along the path. Each story struck a chord, reminding everyone of why the trail mattered so deeply. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, gripping the petition tighter than ever. My hand shook, but my voice stayed steady. "This isn't just about a trail," I said, scanning the room. "It's about who we are as a community. Are we going to let someone impose their vision on us without listening? Or are we going to protect what makes this place special?" The room erupted in agreement. People clapped, whistled, and cheered. Even those who had initially supported Karen seemed unsure now, glancing around nervously as the tide turned against her. Karen tried to counter, insisting that compromise was still possible. But her arguments sounded hollow, especially when an older man stood up and yelled, "Why don't you move if you hate it here so much?" The crowd roared with laughter, breaking the tension. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely flustered, her mask of confidence cracked, revealing frustration and disbelief. As the debate dragged on, it became clear that Karen was fighting a losing battle. When the chairperson finally called for a vote, the decision was unanimous. No paving, no lighting poles, no benches. The trail would remain untouched. Cheers filled the room, echoing off the walls. Someone even started chanting, "Save the trail." Soon, the entire room joined in, their voices loud and triumphant. Karen sank into her chair, defeated, her face flushed red. And for once, she didn't have a comeback. As people filed out of the room, celebrating the victory, I caught sight of her packing up her clipboard. She avoided eye contact, her movements stiff and hurried. Rumors began swirling that she was considering selling her house, though no one could confirm it. Either way, her influence in the neighborhood was fading fast. That night, as I walked Luna along the trail, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The orange spray paint had been scrubbed away, and new wildflowers were beginning to bloom where they'd been trampled. The forest smelled fresh again, alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, knowing we'd won, but also knowing this fight had changed us forever. I've always found peace in the little things, things that remind me of how beautiful the world can be when it's left untouched. That's why I fell in love with the hiking trail behind my neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple dirt path winding through tall trees and wildflowers. But to me, it was perfect. Every weekend, I'd grab my boots, call Luna, my golden retriever, and head out for hours of quiet exploration. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles mixed with damp earth. Birds chirped overhead. Leaves rustled in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and Luna's happy panting as she trotted ahead. That trail wasn't just a place to walk. It was an escape. Life has a way of piling on stress. The bills, the deadlines, the endless to-do lists. But out there, none of that mattered. For those few hours each week, I felt free. And honestly, I thought everyone else felt the same way. Neighbors occasionally crossed paths on the trail, nodding or exchanging quick smiles. Some brought their kids, others walked alone, lost in thought. We didn't say much, but there was a kind of unspoken understanding. This was our space, a shared treasure we all cherished. Then Karen moved in. At first glance, she seemed harmless enough. She was one of those people who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Perfect hair, designer clothes, and a shiny white SUV parked in her driveway. But within days of arriving, Karen started making waves. She introduced herself to everyone with practiced charm, asking questions about the neighborhood and offering suggestions before anyone even asked. Her ideas weren't bad per se. They ranged from organizing block parties to improving curb appeal, but something about her tone rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't curiosity or genuine interest. It felt more like control. It didn't take long for Karen to set her sights on the trail. One evening, while scrolling through emails, I stumbled across a message sent by her to the HOA board. In it, she suggested upgrading the trail to make it safer and more accessible. Safer? Accessible? My heart sank as I read further. Apparently, Karen wanted to pave over the dirt path and install lighting poles. Lighting poles? On a hiking trail? Who did she think she was? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Paving the trail would ruin everything that made it special. Sure, maybe some people would find it convenient, but at what cost? Would families really flock here because of a paved path? Or would they stick to playgrounds and parks designed specifically for strollers and bikes? This trail wasn't meant for that kind of traffic. It was raw, untamed, a slice of nature right in our backyard. As I stewed over Karen's proposal, anger began bubbling inside me. Who gave her the right to decide the fate of something so many of us loved? Why should her vision override everyone else's? I knew then that I couldn't stay silent. If Karen got her way, the trail would never be the same, and neither would our neighborhood. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would test not only my patience, but also the unity of Willow Ridge Estates. The next Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. It felt like the perfect day for a hike, a chance to clear my head after that unsettling email from Karen. I grabbed my backpack, filled a water bottle, and called Luna to join me. As we stepped onto the trail, I tried to push thoughts of paving and lighting poles out of my mind. This was my sanctuary, and I wasn't ready to let anyone take it away. But as I rounded a bend about 15 minutes in, my heart sank. There, standing in the middle of the path, was Karen herself. She looked completely out of place in her designer yoga pants and pristine sneakers, holding a clipboard like she owned the place. Behind her were two men wearing neon vests and carrying measuring tapes. They moved awkwardly along the trail, marking trees and jotting notes. My stomach churned at the sight. This wasn't just talk anymore. Karen was already taking action. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "Oh, hi," Karen said brightly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're just doing some assessments. The HOA thought it might be time to give this trail a little upgrade." "Upgrade," I repeated, glancing around at the untouched beauty surrounding us. "What kind of upgrade?" "Well," she began, gesturing vaguely toward the forest. "Paving would make it more accessible. And maybe adding benches or lighting posts. You know, something more modern. Something everyone can enjoy." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Modern. Benches. Lighting posts. None of this made sense. "This trail is supposed to feel natural," I said firmly. "That's why people come here, to get away from all that stuff." Karen tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words, but her expression remained smug. "Not everyone shares your rustic preferences," she replied smoothly. "Some of us value convenience and safety. Besides, change is good, don't you think?" Her tone grated on me. How could she dismiss something so important with such casual disregard? Before I could respond, one of the men behind her called out, pointing to a cluster of wildflowers. "Should we mark these too?" he asked. "Yes, definitely," Karen answered without hesitation. "They'll need to go if we're widening the path." My blood boiled. Those wildflowers weren't weeds. They were part of what made the trail special. Yet here she was, treating them like obstacles to be removed. Clutching Luna's leash tightly, I forced myself to take a deep breath. Arguing with Karen now wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving her and her team behind. As I continued down the trail, anger simmered beneath the surface. Every step felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached my favorite spot, a quiet clearing where sunlight filtered through the trees, I couldn't hold back anymore. I sat down on a fallen log, buried my face in my hands, and let out a frustrated groan. Luna nudged my arm gently, as if sensing my distress. "This isn't right," I muttered aloud, scratching behind her ears. "She can't just come in and ruin everything." By the time I got home, I'd made up my mind. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But this wasn't just about me. It was about protecting something bigger than myself, something worth fighting for. By the time I got home, my mind was racing. The image of Karen and her team measuring trees and marking wildflowers kept replaying in my head like a bad dream. How could she think paving over the trail was a good idea? It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who loved this place as much as I did. If I didn't act fast, the trail would be gone forever. That afternoon, I decided to talk to my neighbors, starting with Mr. Thompson, an older man who lived 2 doors down. I knocked on his door and waited nervously. He answered holding a pair of binoculars, his usual gear for birdwatching. "Hey there," he said warmly. "What brings you by?" "I need your help," I began, explaining everything that had happened. To my relief, Mr. Thompson's face darkened almost immediately. "Pave the trail," he exclaimed, shaking his head. "That woman has no idea what she's messing with. Count me in. I'll do whatever it takes to stop her." Encouraged by his reaction, I visited other houses nearby. Greg, the quiet guy 3 doors down, listened intently before nodding grimly. "She can't mess with this place," he muttered. Even Mrs. Patel, who always seemed too busy tending her garden to care about anything else, agreed to sign a petition once I explained how the changes might affect the neighborhood's character. Together, we drafted a simple but powerful message: "Save our trail." Over the next few days, signatures poured in, from young families, retirees, dog walkers, and even kids who used the path to ride their bikes. Seeing everyone come together gave me hope. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. Armed with nearly half the neighborhood's support, I sent an email to the HOA board demanding an emergency meeting. In the subject line, I wrote boldly, "Urgent. Community concerns about proposed trail changes." I attached the petition and included photos of the trail, the towering trees, the vibrant wildflowers, the peaceful clearings. Each photo told a story of why this place mattered so much. The response came quickly. The HOA agreed to hold a meeting the following Thursday. As soon as the date was set, word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People started talking about nothing else, on front porches, at the mailbox, during evening walks. Some were furious, others anxious, but everyone shared one thing in common: they cared deeply about the trail. Still, not everyone was on board. A small group of residents supported Karen's plan, arguing that paved paths would attract more users and increase property values. They claimed the upgrades would make the trail safer for families with strollers or elderly neighbors using walkers. While their points weren't entirely unreasonable, they missed the bigger picture. This trail wasn't meant to be convenient. It was meant to be natural, untouched, and free. As the days passed, tension simmered beneath the surface. Conversations grew heated, and friendships felt strained. One evening, while walking Luna, I overheard two neighbors debating loudly near the cul-de-sac. "Why are you letting emotions get in the way of progress?" one asked sharply. "Because progress doesn't have to mean destruction," the other shot back. Despite the growing divide, I refused to give up. Every signature, every conversation, every moment spent defending the trail fueled my determination. By the time Thursday rolled around, I was ready to stand in front of the entire neighborhood and remind them of what truly mattered, ready to show Karen and anyone else who doubted us that this trail was worth fighting for. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived, and the air felt thick with anticipation. I woke up early, my stomach tied in knots. By noon, word had spread throughout the neighborhood, and cars began filling the parking lot outside the community center. This wasn't going to be just another routine gathering. It was clear that people were taking this seriously. Neighbors who rarely attended meetings showed up, some carrying lawn chairs because they knew the room wouldn't have enough seating. Others brought notebooks or phones to document what happened. The energy was electric, a mix of hope, anger, and uncertainty. When I walked into the room, I was struck by how packed it was. Every seat was taken, and clusters of people stood along the walls, whispering nervously. At the front of the room sat Karen, perfectly composed as always, her clipboard resting on the table in front of her. She wore a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, looking every bit like someone ready to deliver a polished presentation. Beside her were two members of the HOA board, their expressions neutral but wary. As the meeting began, the chairperson called for order, though it took several minutes for the murmurs to die down. When Karen finally rose to speak, the room fell silent. She smiled confidently, her voice smooth and practiced as she launched into her pitch. "This trail has so much potential," she said, gesturing toward a slideshow projected onto the wall behind her. Pictures of paved paths from other neighborhoods appeared, one lined with benches, another illuminated by soft lampposts. "These upgrades will make it safer, more accessible, and more appealing to everyone." Her words sounded rehearsed, almost robotic. As she spoke about convenience and modernization, I glanced around the room. Some people nodded thoughtfully, clearly swayed by her arguments, but others looked skeptical, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Thompson scowled openly, while Greg crossed his arms tightly over his chest. Even Mrs. Patel, usually so mild-mannered, shook her head slightly. Then it was my turn to speak. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, clutching the petition tightly in my hands. For a moment, I hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of all those eyes on me. But then I remembered why I was there, for the trail, for the quiet moments it gave us, for the wildflowers and the birdsong, and the peace it brought to our lives. Taking a deep breath, I began. "This isn't about property values or convenience," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves coursing through me. "It's about preserving something rare and beautiful, something that belongs to all of us." I held up the petition, showing the dozens of signatures. Hundreds of us use this trail not because it's perfect, but because it's real. It connects us to nature in a way that no paved path ever could. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Someone near the back shouted, "Leave it alone," followed by scattered applause. Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. She countered with statistics, numbers about increased usage, higher safety ratings, and even vague promises of grant money for improvements. Her tone grew sharper, more defensive, as if she sensed the tide turning against her. But the damage was done. People weren't buying it anymore. One woman stood up, her face flushed with emotion. "My kids love this trail," she said firmly. "They don't need lights or benches. They need trees and dirt and freedom. Why can't we keep it the way it is? Others chimed in, sharing stories of their own connection to the trail. A young man talked about teaching his daughter how to identify birds. An elderly neighbor described how walking the path helped him stay active. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning the meeting into something far bigger than a debate over asphalt. It became a fight for identity, for what kind of community we wanted to be. By the time the discussion wound down, Karen looked rattled. Her confident facade had cracked, revealing glimpses of frustration beneath. Still, she refused to back down, insisting that compromise was possible. But the crowd wasn't having it. When the chairperson called for a vote, the decision was unanimous. The trail would remain untouched. As I left the meeting that night, relief washed over me, but also resolve. This victory felt fragile, like it could slip away at any moment. And deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. The meeting may have ended with a win for the trail, but the battle was far from over. If anything, Karen seemed more determined than ever to get her way. She didn't shout or throw tantrums. No, that wasn't her style. Instead, she played a quieter, sneakier game, and it started early one misty morning when I decided to take Luna for a walk along the trail. As we turned onto the path, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I saw them. Bright orange spray-painted marks slashed across tree trunks and stakes, driven into the ground where wildflowers once grew. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message. Someone had marked the trail for construction, even though the HOA vote had been clear. I knelt down to examine the damage, anger bubbling inside me. Who did this? The answer was obvious. Karen. She hadn't waited for approval or permission. She'd gone ahead and taken matters into her own hands. It was as if she thought she could wear us down, force her vision onto the neighborhood, whether we liked it or not. Determined to expose what she'd done, I snapped photos of the destruction. I captured every spray-painted X, every stake sticking out of the earth like a scar. When I got home, I posted the pictures online, tagging local environmental groups and news outlets. Within hours, the story blew up. Comments flooded in, calling Karen everything from entitled to out of touch. People rallied around the cause, sharing their own love for the trail and vowing to protect it. But Karen didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. That evening, an email landed in everyone's inbox. From her, naturally. She accused me of spreading misinformation and warned that anyone interfering with her project would face legal consequences. Her tone was icy, her words carefully chosen to sound authoritative. But beneath the polished language, I could sense her desperation. She was losing control, and she knew it. Tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Conversations at mailboxes turned into heated arguments. Some neighbors sided with Karen, believing her promises of modernization and increased property values. Others stood firmly with me, furious at her attempts to bulldoze our wishes. Friendships frayed, and small talk became rare. Even kids noticed the shift. One afternoon, I overheard two boys debating whose mom was right about the trail. Karen's actions only fueled the resistance. Volunteers organized cleanup days, scrubbing away the spray paint and replanting damaged areas. Signs went up along the trail, reminding users to respect the land and report any suspicious activity. For the first time, I saw neighbors working side by side, not just to save the trail, but to reclaim a sense of unity. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about stopping Karen anymore. It was about proving that our voices mattered, that we could stand together against someone who tried to impose her will on all of us. Every act of defiance, the petitions, the cleanups, the online posts, was a declaration. This was our trail, and no amount of intimidation would change that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished yet. She was too stubborn, too convinced she was right. Whatever happened next, I knew we'd need to stay vigilant, because the moment we let our guard down, she'd strike again, and I wasn't about to let that happen, not without a fight. In the weeks that followed the meeting, life in Willow Ridge Estates slowly began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get after such a dramatic showdown. The trail remained untouched, its wild beauty preserved for everyone to enjoy. Volunteers continued their efforts to heal the damage Karen had caused, replanting wildflowers and reinforcing signs that reminded users to respect the land. It was heartwarming to see neighbors working together, united by a shared love for something greater than themselves. Karen kept mostly to herself after that. She stopped attending neighborhood events and rarely ventured outside, except to drive her shiny white SUV to work. Rumors circulated that she'd listed her house for sale, though no for sale sign ever appeared in her yard. Whether or not she planned to leave, one thing was certain: her influence over the community had evaporated. People who once tiptoed around her now spoke openly about how glad they were to see her plans fail. Even those who had initially supported her admitted privately that they preferred the trail the way it was. As for me, I found myself visiting the trail more often than ever. Each step along the winding path felt like a reminder of what we'd fought for and won. At my favorite spot, the quiet clearing where sunlight filtered through the trees, I paused one afternoon, sitting on a fallen log with Luna curled up beside me. The air smelled fresh, carrying hints of pine and earth, just as it always had. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. But this experience had changed me, and not just because I'd stood up to someone like Karen. It taught me the power of standing together, of finding strength in numbers when faced with something bigger than ourselves. Before all this, I might have shrugged off her plans, assuming there was nothing I could do. Now, I knew better. I realized that sometimes fighting for what you love brings people closer than anything else ever could. The neighborhood itself seemed different too. Conversations flowed more freely. Laughter echoed down the streets again, and strangers greeted each other warmly. Folks who had barely spoken before were now organizing weekend cleanups and planning potluck dinners. The battle over the trail hadn't just saved a piece of nature, it had strengthened our sense of community. One evening, as I walked Luna home under a golden sunset, I noticed Greg standing in his driveway tinkering with his car. He looked up and waved, smiling genuinely for the first time since I'd met him. "Thanks for everything," he called out. "We couldn't have done it without you." I shook my head, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was all of us." He nodded thoughtfully before returning to his work, leaving me to reflect on how far we'd come. This fight hadn't been easy. It had tested friendships, patience, and even our faith in one another. But in the end, it brought us closer together. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were allies, bound by a shared victory and a renewed appreciation for the place we called home. Now, whenever I hike the trail, I pause at that same clearing, letting the stillness wash over me. The memory of Karen's attempt to pave it lingers faintly, like a scar that reminds me of what we almost lost. But mostly, I think about how much we gained: unity, resilience, and a deeper connection to the natural world around us. And every time I hear birdsong or catch a whiff of pine needles, I smile, because this trail isn't just dirt and trees. It's proof that when people care enough to stand together, they can protect what matters most.